This is the Vajra Regent Ursula Tenzin and a seminar entitled Meditation in the Three Yanas held at Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado. This is talk number 4, June 25th, 1979. This is an ARP digital remaster made November 2007.
Good evening. We are continuing our discussion of meditation practice. We have been discussing the discipline of sitting in terms of Shamatha. Being the development of peace, or we talked about last time relaxation and the sense of well-being. And I think it is important for all of us to realize as we go along in our study that without this firm foundation, the further study would be impossible. In fact, there is always the danger of perversion, that you could hear teaching upon teaching. You might hear all kinds of techniques of how to do this or that, but unless you have very strong sense of discipline, a very strong sense of actually taming your mind, then it would be extremely difficult, almost impossible, to go any further, to hear any other teaching. The whole aspect of taming one's mind is very important to us. Again, we are involved in the practical situation. We're talking about application of teachings which have been presented, taught, and practiced for 2,500 years. So we're not at all talking about any kind of speculation. We're talking about application, practice. So without that sense of being grounded, being on the ground, relating with the earth, being relaxed in body and mind, letting body and mind be as they are, or as it is. Without that, appreciation of Dharma, or appreciation of living one's life without aggression, becomes very difficult. In all of our lives, we have that sense of being able to live without aggression. Everybody does. It's kind of basic underlying thing. How we're attracted to such a discipline as meditation practice, how we're attracted to hearing the teachings, Dharma, formal Dharma as teachings. All of that comes about because as human beings, we possess some kind of basic nature of being grounded, being sane. That groundedness is expressed through the practice of sitting meditation. Expressed in a certain way that with all our restlessness, which is experienced as drowsiness and wildness, which was talked about last time by the Vajracharya. With all of that, we have experienced a sense of that we can actually come back to nowness, to being with the breath, to actually experiencing breath going out and dissolving in space. We can actually do that. So as we continue to practice, we begin to feel some kind of confidence in being who we are, which is basically unconditional. It's not who we are as ... as somebody or other, but just who we are as we are. Through Shamatha practice, we develop that confidence and that sense of being. And even the notion that we have, or the experience that we have the power, or the concentration, or the ability to come back to the point is very uplifting. In fact, we could say it's basic good news. The best news we've had, as long as we can remember, that we can actually come back, be here. That we don't need any props to do that as well. We don't need any belief system, any kind of philosophy or metaphysics or anything. Just from our own experience as human beings, we can actually come back, be here. Practice that way. That kind of experience is very necessary in order to become further involved with Dharma, to become a Dharmic person. Well, frankly speaking, before that, we're lucky if we remember one moment to the next. It's very difficult to remember anything, let alone keep our attention on what somebody's saying for 2 minutes, 3 minutes. We sort of go in and out, mixed with our fantasies, our memories, our bodily sensations, the environment. We mix the whole thing together. So, Shamatha practice is basically sorting out that process and sticking to the point. Not only sticking to the point, but realizing that, quite simply, we can come back to the point. And the point being mindfulness of just what is going on in the very moment. That's the point we're talking about. And this practice is not simply a stage that you can discard when you hear the better things, or the so-called higher teachings. What we're involved with as we go along is the notion of path, journey, which involves the ground you walk on and the walker, yourself as a practitioner, and the relationship between the two. So in terms of a real journeyman, journey woman, journey person, how's that for being modern, huh? Journeyer, is that you don't leave anything behind. In other words, you don't pollute anything by throwing your garbage on the side of the road. But your journey is so well thought out and so definitely experienced that everything you have with you is workable and part of the journey. So your experience of a shamatha practice is kind of like the ground you first stepped on, the path you first walked on. And it continues throughout the whole journey, up to and including the experience of enlightenment, or the realization of enlightenment, or enlightenment. It's like building a fortress. If you don't study the land, if you don't build the proper foundation, possibly later on, your magnificent fortress will collapse. Which happened. Did anybody read that? Where was it? Where there's a big stadium. Kansas City, right. Which won architectural awards for being so wonderfully done. Collapsed. I don't know if this is true, but somebody told me that it won awards because it didn't have any support systems. But maybe that's true. When we talk about support or foundation, it's not the sense of relying on a concept, but it's basically this. The notion of coming back to here, coming back to this. No matter what occurs in your experience, you can always come back. Whatever kind of fantasy or provoking situation occurs when you're sitting, practicing meditation, you can always come back. Well, that sense of coming back leads us to our discussion tonight, which is that when we experience mindfulness and the discipline of being in the moment, then quite naturally we begin to become aware of the space around the moment. We begin to become aware of more than just our sense of being a practitioner in the moment, but that practitioner and that moment also has an environment. I believe the Vajracharya talked a little bit about this last time. And this kind of experience we're talking about now is known as the development of insight, or the Vipassana experience, Laktong in Tibetan, which is to say that when you develop pure, a clean discipline of being in the moment, then automatically that particular moment begins to expand beyond the notion of myself and my practice. That sense of expansion is a more or less organic, natural process. On the other hand, it involves a very specific technical point in the meditation practice. And that is, very simply, the arising of intellect without ego. Well, you may be practicing very hard and sticking to your discipline and going with the breath and actually feeling the struggle of doing that and actually relaxing that struggle, finally coming back, being with the breath, going out with the breath, feeling at home with yourself, but you might hear some teaching and you wonder, how can I make sense out of this whole thing? How am I going to make sense out of it? That's the notion of intellect arising in your practice. How to make sense out of this whole thing, this whole notion of what we're doing why we're doing it, how we're doing it, what are its boundaries, what is it for, what does it include, what doesn't it include. Now, pretty much, it's pretty hard to hear anything like that unless you develop a mind of wakefulness, mindfulness, because you can't remember all that much, as we talked about. Generally speaking, intellect is like the wind in terms of neurosis or samsaric life. Blows one way, blows the other. You have generally one idea about something, and it blows the other way, and then you have another idea about it, and it goes back and forth like that. There's no definiteness, no sense of actually knowing what's going on. With the Shamatha practice, we're actually pinpointing the mechanism of knowing. Because of that, Shamatha practice, it expands into the experience of knowing. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mechanism of knowing is, through Shamatha practice, seeing how mind works. Okay? Just as a little reminder, seeing how mind works means not doing anything. Allowing things to arise and sticking with the basic technique. Well, it's like being sick. When you're really sick and you can't hold up your ego thing anymore, basically something happens to you. You get really sick. Big flu, maybe worse. And you can't do your usual razzmatazz about being who you are. You're flat on your back. Out. You call the doctor. The doctor said, take this medicine regularly or else you won't get better. So you take it regularly because you feel so sick that you want to get better. So you take it regularly and you begin to feel better. At that point you begin to think, why did I get sick? Once you regain your strength and start to feel awake and confident, you start to think, why did I get sick? And that's basically the whole notion of a Vipassana experience here, is that once you have accomplished your discipline of staying with the moment, being with the moment, dissolving the moment, thought arises, how did that come about anyway? That I used to feel so bad, so confused. And now I feel good, healthy. How did that come about? You start to think in that way. Well, it also has another side of it. You start to think, why am I doing this anyway? It doesn't seem to make any sense anymore. I feel better. You know, that kind of thing. That happens. You start to think that the meditation practice really doesn't make any sense, you know, because you're not doing anything. So, you know, I feel all right, so why should I not do nothing? I can actually go out and do something. But at the same time, you wonder, well, why did I think that? Why should I think at this point that I can go out and do something? Well, that's very significant, actually. The sense of the birth of intellect without ego. Healthy intellect means that we're not talking about I can go out and do something so that I can be great and push myself on everybody, but that sense of expansion, that something can work, something can happen. Also, the sense of inquisitiveness about one's practice. we start to become very inquisitive about what we're doing and what we're experiencing, down to very minute details. Very minute details. The notion of vipassana is called the experience of clear seeing, seeing clearly, clear seeing, or insight. And it has very much to do with what is called the post-meditation experience. In other words, you may do intensive sitting practice on your cushion, but as you get up and walk about in your daily life, there's some kind of echo going on of practice. Some kind of echo continues. And obviously, you can't just try to apply Shamatha technique while you're walking down the street. Light turns green, you're walking across, say, breathe out, go out with the breath. You can't quite do that. So, something comes along with you, when you leave your sitting period of meditation. And that is the notion of two things. One is the birth of a dharmic intellect, or inquisitiveness to the point of what's going on altogether with this life, so-called life. And the other one is sense of coming back, returning. Now you think, how can I return to a technique? Well, I'm ordering a hot dog, if you do such things, which probably we do. Or, filet whatever, and whatever you get in Boulder. And how can I actually be right in the moment when I say to the waiter or waitress, I would like filet mignon, or I would like a hot dog? It seems rather silly after you leave your cushion. The whole thing begins to have some kind of echo of absurdity and silliness, hollowness. As you've practiced really hard, you begin to see the things and the experiences of your world as absent of any meaning. They don't have any meaning. Hot dog. Filet. Filet. Steak. Mother. Family. Pleasure. House. Telephone bill. You have this experience of some kind of transparency altogether in your environment, altogether. Which is a very significant step in the practice of meditation, that you begin to see the transparency beyond your particular thought patterns. You see what I mean? When you're sitting, you have particular memories, particular thought patterns, particular bodily sensations. As you leave your cushion, walk into the world, so-called world, you have environmental thought patterns, which are not only yours, they're everybody else's as well, like AT&T. Salt 2. Salt 3 for the pepper. you begin to feel some kind of flip-flop in what's going on. That could be very disturbing, extremely disturbing from your practice. The result of your practice could be extremely disturbing, that the whole thing doesn't make sense. Now, at that very point, you should apply the notion of mindfulness again, but not in the same way. What we're talking about here is the recognition of the environment beyond one's practice, which is very important. There is an environment beyond one's practice. The sense of awareness is what we're talking about. Vipassana practice. We're talking about practice actually now, not theory, practice. Vipassana practice is the recognition of awareness beyond one's practice. What occurs is that through shamatha practice, we become very watchful or aware of everything that goes on. We become aware of details in a different way. It's almost as if you had a radar system going around constantly. That occurs because of your mindfulness practice. When you leave, everything is so sensitive, begins to actually pulsate, send some kind of message to you. In the beginning, it's very abrupt, and you feel shocked by the detail. You've been working so hard to be just as we are, right here. And then suddenly, you hear sound. You hear the sound of simple thing, a backfire of a car. A bird near your window. The sound of your coin in a Coke machine dropping. And suddenly it seems to have so many implications. And that is the notion of the beginning of awareness. You actually begin to feel the implication or the environment. We're saying the same thing. When we talk about implication and environment, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about greater sense of mindfulness, extending sense of non-ego. So, what happens to us? We begin to feel that it's possible not to be overwhelmed by detail, because we actually begin to see the detail of this environment we live in, so-called world, phenomenal reality. Because of our shamatha practice, a sense of being relaxed with it, straightforward, not dishonest in any way, just looking at things in an unbiased way, we begin to see the detail of things. But possibly we might be shocked by that detail. In this case, we have to practice awareness. Okay? Can you stay with me for a little bit longer? when the detail, aside from sitting practice, becomes very vibrant and real, we have to stay with it a little bit longer than we usually do. We have to involve the sense of including something else in our practice, something more. And that comes about by developing what's called inquisitive mind. Developing inquisitive mind. If you have no fear in being who you are, then you have no fear in looking at what occurs in the realm of who you are. Now, this particular experience we're talking about is very practical in the sense that when you don't have the reference point of practice, shamatha practice, when you're sitting here, your zafus, cushions, when you don't have that reference point, how do you practice? How do you remember to practice? First of all, the spark of mindfulness is with you anyway, because you have tamed your mind to the point where you're not so frivolous about me, big deal about me. Therefore, when something occurs in the environment other than practice, you begin to look at it. And what do you look at? Well, there's detail, number one. So many details in our world. And then number two, there are absurd details, which don't seem to fit into our state of mind. And number three, there's more than absurd details, there's the definite quality of absurd details. And number four, there is finally our gossip about absurd details. So, if you're practicing properly, and if there are details which come at you, you're not shocked or put off by details. Rather, you're actually looking at them very clearly because of shamatha practice, because you have developed a sense of mindfulness. When details come up, you're not shocked about who's me and who's that. Am I the detail or is that the detail? Something comes up in your environment, outside of your practice. You're not shocked by that. You actually can sort out. The whole notion of sorting out one thing from another, sorting out dharmas, is the beginning of Vipassana practice. The basic notion of discriminating one dharma from another. You know, so many things happen in our life. We're bombarded by so many things. And we find it very hard to make a decision between toast with butter or jam. Or is it orange, raspberry, strawberry? The waitress comes, she says, well, we have pecan, apple, strawberry, blueberry, raspberry, pecan. And he said, could you repeat that again? What kind of pie do you have? Well, that's basically what goes on with us all the time. Details come popping up just like that. So could you repeat that again? I have a happy moment, a sad moment, a good moment, bad moment. What would you like? And generally say, huh? What? What did you say? In this case, we're talking about some kind of environmental awareness that details do not become so mushed together that they're confused. Because of mindfulness, because you have distinguished in the mindfulness practice, basically your thought process, your bodily sensations, breath, whatnot, that when you actually leave your sitting practice, you can distinguish Very simply, the notion of experience. Different kinds of experience. You distinguish those. Secondly, because you're not confused about this experience or that one, also you can look into the origin of those experiences. For instance, something very crude or drastic occurs in your life. Or on the other hand, something very gentle and soft occurs in your life. And you wonder, where did that come from? How did that happen? The whole notion of developing the Vipassana experience is inquisitive mind into the experience, whatever it might be. Whether it's completely out of the ordinary, something that never happened to you before, or it's completely ordinary, something that happens to you constantly, or it's mediocre, something that happens to you now and then, you can actually awaken your intellectual process in a very simple sense. Because your mind is so awake, mindful, you can actually notice, how did it begin? How does it continue? And where does it go? Those three things occur all the time in the Vipassana experience. Origin, how something begins, where it dwells, and where it dissolves. And that's a very fundamental experience to all of us. And we're not talking about simply those things which are very sort of striking. Like you have a very shocking experience. Your friend comes in and opens the door and says, "My wife just died." Just like that. And suddenly you might be shocked. But with the Vipassana experience, we're talking about, you're not shocked, particularly, but you're extremely inquisitive as to the nature of the whole thing. We're not talking about any kind of, hopefully, Freudian stuff. We're not talking about analysis. We're talking about your mind is awake, so awake that the experience of the moment ignites one's intellect, your intellect, as to how did this happen? Did I feel this way? And what happens next? That you can actually follow your experience throughout a whole cycle. Whether it's a fear or passion or love, hate, jealousy, whatever it is, contentment, whatever it is, you can follow the whole cycle. And not only follow it, you're inquisitive as to how that thing actually occurs. Not only how it occurs, what's the texture of it when it occurs. Say you feel delighted to be here tonight. You feel good about what you're hearing. It sounds good. Well, how'd that happen? And not only how did that happen, how is it sustaining itself? And also, if it subsides, where does it go? This is a very important practical approach to our everyday experience, post-meditation experience. And the notion here we're talking about is not only something which is striking or vibrant, but also that which is seemingly insignificant. That the experience of Vipassana is kind of like the total awareness, total sense of safeguard of your mindfulness, that nothing should get by, nothing whatsoever. In other words, you shouldn't trust anything in your environment. even the slightest little notion, slightest little perception of the wind on your back could be the birth of ego, or could be the birth of awareness. So that's it. Have any questions? We have microphones? Microphone? Somebody in the front? Two.
By not trusting anything, do you mean ignoring things? Like, oh, that's another. Just relaxing too much?
What?
Oh, okay. You said you don't trust anything.
That's right.
Yeah. By that, do you mean by trusting things? Do you mean sort of ignoring them, like just going, oh, that's happening, and just ignoring it and not really paying attention to it?
That's the same thing as trusting things.
Yeah.
When you trust things, you ignore them.
Okay. And you sort of relax too much.
Yeah. It doesn't have that twofold quality. Actually, we should talk about that. There's twofold quality of relaxation and sharpness at the same time, which comes out of Shamatha practice and moves into Vipassana experience. That you're easy with yourself from the point of view of being without ego, but you're hard on yourself when any sense of drowsiness and laziness. So it goes that way. Yeah.
Sir, I can't quite understand how it's not analysis when you figure things out. Is it conscious that you're doing it?
Well, sure, it's part of consciousness, yeah, sure.
I'm saying, you consciously say, how did this happen? Where did it come from?
Yes, you do, but you don't take that seriously. Because of your shamatha practice, can you really take it seriously when you say, well, I think the difference is basically this. I would like to know how this happened, as opposed to, how did this happen? It's very simple that way. Mm-hmm. When you have the, I would like to know, it's because you're threatened. But when you have the, how did this happen, it's because of some kind of actually brilliant intelligence coming out. Just looking at things. How did this happen? It's not because it means anything particular to me, but because there's some kind of spark of awareness of some sort of bigger thing.
Thank you.
The last thing you said about when you're aware of the wind on your back, the distinction between whether it's the birth of ego or the birth of awareness, is that all dependent on what you do then, at that point?
Well, it's depending on two things. What's come before and what precedes. If you have some kind of mindfulness practice, then the wind on your back is not significant to you, but actually can give birth to wind on my back as expression of environment, texture of the environment.
After you become aware of the things going on in your environment, is it part of the practice to then act on what you're aware of?
Well, I'm not concerned about the after part. What we're talking about here is the practical part of when you become aware.
Is the practice not concerned with the after part?
It's not concerned with the after part, no. Seriously. It's concerned with the when. Exactly when you become aware. Well, I'll tell you what. What comes next? No, you tell me right now. Do you have to think about it?
Well, okay, I'll tell you what
Good.
I'm thinking about. Actually, what I'm thinking about is becoming aware of things going on in this so-called day and age, becoming aware of maybe great harms that are coming to the earth and to the world.
That's right. That's what the Vipassana experience is all about.
And then what happens when I become aware of these things is I have a great desire to do something about it.
That's right. Great. That's the whole idea. That's what happens. When you actually practice meditation properly and your sense of mindfulness becomes awareness, you begin to see that what we call our world is actually the notion of samsara, or continuing pain. It's continuing pain all the time. If people don't see the moment, if they don't see that there's more to it than themselves, there's more to this whole life than oneself. If they don't see that, then they suffer always. Tremendous pain.
If I understood correctly, you said that the practice is just to become aware of that idea, but it's not concerned with what you do about it.
Well, I don't know about become aware of an idea. I think that if you practice properly, the whole notion of existence as being so temporary and fleeting, it comes to you. You don't have to become aware about it. It comes to you. You know how that happens. Yeah. Then maybe you start to think, I can't hold my awareness, my sense of being saved to myself. There's something further that has to happen. That's the notion of the birth of intellect, that you can actually see things. Beyond yourself. Do you know what I mean? Beyond yourself. Your personal experience of what you know isn't all that important when you start to look at the world and those millions of faces. And maybe so much suffering altogether because they haven't actually seen clearly that there is no such thing as ego. And there's no cause for alarm. But there's a lot more work to do.
Yeah. A lot more.
You see, you can't just rest there. Obviously, I think everybody could feel that. That so you feel some sense of being liberated from that. But when you look around, then you begin to become frightened that other people don't really see that, and you're really in a hostile world. terms of the confusion. That you can't carry it as your armor. You know, that you practice shamatha, you experience vipassana, and you're so good that you can hold on to it, because you can't. Anyway, that comes along next time. But that's true.
Thank you.
When you began to discuss moving from shamatha to vipassana, you said that at that point you apply notion of recollection, but it's different.
I beg your pardon? At that point, I didn't hear you at.
Well, you were saying that
At that point,
the notion of recollection is different. That the practice itself is different. That's what you said. And then as you went on, I didn't quite catch
what's different?
what the difference is. I mean, the way you're describing the 4 foundations of mindfulness sounded so similar that I couldn't quite.
Well, the whole notion here is that what we're talking about in Vipassana experience is experiencing the boundaries of one's practice. You see, you practice very hard, and you should practice very hard, because without practicing very hard, you can have no notion of what's beyond, in terms of intellect, in terms of understanding Dharma. What we have to do, basically, is tame our mind to be here. Once you actually can be here and extend that sense of being here through your practice, then you begin to wake up further. When you walk out of the situation, even when the gong rings and you take your first step off the cushion, there's a sense of environment. Even when you're sitting, that's true, but more so when you're not sitting. There's a sense of environment and a sense of Dharma actually happening in your life. That sense of environment is actual Dharma happening to you.
Well, it still sounds as though it's in the sense of coming back that naturally occurs. In that when regardless of where you are,
coming back, but in this case, we're not talking about effort as much as we are in shamatha practice, which I wouldn't, I'm not talking about everybody should give up shamatha practice particularly. I'm talking about in your post-meditation experience, there is a sense of effortlessness, which is awareness, that you don't have to crank up being mindful, but mindfulness comes back to you as environment. Little things happen. You may notice a little thing happen. Stone falls in front of your foot. Something like that. It doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean anything at all. Let's forget about meaning, okay? I'm not talking about meaning. But the experience of the world or phenomena as such brings you back to mindfulness. That's awareness. Okay? Brings you back to mindfulness as awareness in everyday life. Walking in the street, doing your job, answering the phone, eating a peach that you don't think is quite ripe. Pick it up and you say, doesn't look quite ripe. And you sink your teeth into it. And as you sink your teeth into it, you think it's not quite ripe. That sense of awareness, you see? There's some kind of a further sense. We're not talking about simply sticking to the point of not deviating from just the breath and all. But we're talking about when you put your teeth into the peach, you're also not deviating from the breath in terms of awareness. That little thought may arise, it's not quite ripe. I don't like it that way. I like it that way. It's not so bad. Could be worse. 39 cents. You know, those things that generally come up in your sitting practice, when you're sitting, come up when you're eating a peach. But usually you don't think of that as practice. In this case, we're talking about that as practice in the sense of awareness. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess I have them. The way you were describing the 4 foundations of mindfulness in the second talk, I had understood that the way you're describing awareness now is that was how you were describing the 3rd and 4th foundations of mindfulness. And so I had
when you're sitting.
confused.
Well, I was talking about the 4 foundations when you're sitting. Now I'm talking about when you get up. Same thing. Basically the same thing. But now let's be very clear about this whole thing. When you get up, you expand. When you leave your cushion, you as a practitioner, or what's left of ego, expands. Okay? When the gong rings and you get up from sitting, that you becomes dispersed in the environment. And that's a very important point. 4 foundations that we talked about is when you're sitting and experiencing sense of being, well-being, continuation of well-being, effort, which is not straying from well-being, and a sense of coordination of being as we are. And the Rinpoche talked about last time, obstacles to that, needing some kind of faith in one's own sanity, respect for that, and some kind of mindfulness approach, which means that whatever happens brings you back to that, and feeling a sense of drowsiness or wildness or whatever is the notion of one's mind in a neurotic state. Now we're talking about having practiced in that way, when you leave your cushion and stand up, the first moment you put your foot on the ground, you expand the sense of notion of you as a practitioner doesn't actually exist anymore. You see what I mean? As soon as you get up from the cushion, as soon as you put your foot on the ground, or the bell rings, the gong rings, you as a practitioner does not exist anymore. It expands into space. And a lot of things happen. You go home, walk to your car, turn on the ignition, turn on your radio, because you're not sitting anymore. And that sounds like something. And you go home, put your key in the door, and it opens. You walk up. It might be creaky or it might be well carpeted. And you might come and sit, and you immediately go to your kitchen and get something to eat, like a peach. And you hold it in your hand. You might feel it a little bit, So is it ripe? And you think to yourself, well, it's not quite ripe, but I could eat it anyway. And you bite on it. And as you're biting it, say it's not quite right, but it's okay. That's kind of sense of awareness of the whole thing. Even when you bite on the peach, you might be aware of how you close the door and the sound of your footsteps as you walked up to, the whole thing, everything. You see, the whole point is you can't get away from your practice. What we're trying to say here is how we can include everything, what we do in practice.
Thank you.
So you mentioned following the emotions and the texture. In the post-meditation experience, do you take the same attitude of not trusting to the details of what is happening in your own mind?
That's the notion of space around things, you see. That generally speaking, what happens with us is that we begin to believe in one particular thing as opposed to another. We have an emotional experience. And they say, I'm so happy to be here with you. It changes so fast for us all the time. The whole notion is don't believe in any of that stuff. Just to actually be with it. And, you might meet the president of, well, what's a good thing to be a president of? United States? United States, yeah. The president of the United States. And he might say, well, it's a pleasure to meet y'all. Or whatever, And you might think, I'm meeting the president of the United States. Isn't that something, You start to get a little bit excited, Because you believe in that thing, something, as a concept of yours,
So the two are related. Okay. What do you mean by the texture? I'm curious about that.
Well, the texture is meeting the President of the United States. In that sense means being in the room, and the flags are there, and the whole grandeur of the, sort of big globe effect, and the notion of being in a really important place at an important time, that kind of thing. You can appreciate that. You can actually appreciate that. How about if you go to your butcher, and you want a good fish, and you say, I would like a good fish. Do you have anything good? And he says, well, I have this really good fish. And he brings it out and shows you. See, you can appreciate the texture of that. Same as meeting the president of the USA or wherever it is.
I'm confused. You can appreciate it at the same time not trust it?
Yeah, that's right. Appreciate it, but don't trust it.
Seems like a contradiction.
Seems like. Well, the whole notion of it seems like. It means that when you practice very diligently, Shamatha practice, that you have basically no notion of things as being trick, any kind of trick. There's no kind of trick involved. Things are as they are. There's white, blue, red, black, yellow. Very simply. Okay? So you meet the president of the USA or your butcher with that same mind. But there's a little bit more than that at this point. There's a sense of the butcher's approach and liking to present a good fish to you, or the president's approach and trying to be officious to you. Right? So you have some sort of awareness of that as well. So the whole notion is you don't have to be tough on anybody. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, or the president. You don't have to be tough on anybody. Are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah, I think so.
I hope so.
Talking about the space between the distrust and the...
Well, when I say don't trust any of it, means that stick to your basic mindfulness practice. And when I say go with it, means that because of that, you can actually appreciate the president of the USA and your butcher at the same time. It might be a red snapper or whatever. Could be a red snapper. The president could be a red snapper. A redneck snapper.
Mindfulness.
What? What? That's a little joke. What?
Distrust is going with the mindfulness.
I beg your pardon?
That's what you just said.
What did I say? What?
Being mindful in the moment.
Yeah, that's right. It involves intellect as well. It's not being mindful as in terms of being religious to mindfulness. That's what we're talking about, the difference here. Yeah, see? Not being religious to mindfulness, but that what occurs in your environment is also has the quality of mindfulness, which is called awareness.
Thank you.
That's a good point.
You talked about that our support and our foundation are not concepts, but then you went on to talk about the notion of coming back and awareness. That also feels like a concept to me, and I don't understand the difference. How one would be a concept?
Yeah, well, I think the difference is that when you have the notion of coming back, right? You're sitting, practicing, going out with the breath. Then you have the notion of coming back. That very notion of coming back doesn't have any basis. Coming back to what? Same thing in your daily life. If you think that, say, you have an important engagement, so-called important engagement, with the President of the United States. That's called an important engagement, right? So what are you going to do about that? What happens to your awareness at that point? It's like so nervous about how to get the proper thing happening because you're meeting the most important person in your whole world. Now, is that really true? How about when you meet your most important emotion of actually loving somebody or hating somebody or being angry with somebody? The whole thing happens like that. The most important time of your life. This happens all the time, you know. All the time. The most important event I ever had comes next. Next one is the most important thing. The whole point here is that the whole thing is transparent as far as who you're meeting and who you are. The whole thing is transparent, but there's absolutely texture, environment, feeling of the whole thing. It doesn't have anything to do with the ego, like me or that. Me as the person who's meeting the president, as the president as the person who's an important person. It's texture of the meeting on the spot, like right now. You and me. There's some sort of texture happening. It's sort of yellow, maybe, or maybe gray. Well, don't believe me. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Can one relate with a teacher? Because at some point one can see the transparency of the teacher as big deal.
Well, I think the whole notion here, if everybody could listen to this, is that the experience of Vipassana brings about one particular thing, one particular notion, is that you can't actually hold on to your individual liberation, your individual experience. This is where the teacher comes in very prominently. That you might have practiced very good shamatha, really experienced how things work in your mind. And more than that, you might have experienced how devastating a samsara is and how you could actually free yourself from that by being aware of everything that goes on. Not being shocked, but being aware of everything that goes on. But actually, when you come right down to it, that all of that is very mediocre unless you give up completely your sense of holding on to anything that's based on ego, including your liberation, including your fantastic experience of being aware. So that's where the teacher comes in.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should close at this point. In conclusion, shall we say that basic meditation practice of the Shamatha discipline and a further post-meditation experience of Vipassana brings about sense of gentleness to oneself and one's environment. We're talking about basic notion of Dharma, which means passionlessness. In other words, not having an axe to grind about oneself or one's world, not having to lay a trip on anything. Passionlessness. That there is some notion, as you practice, that it is perfectly sane to be as we are, and moreover, it is perfectly sane to let the world be as it is. Those two notions are very important. Because of that, we can actually wake up to the subtleties and descriptions of our world, the manifestations of our world, as being delightful and completely part of our makeup, so to speak, our family. So the world doesn't have to be an enemy as such, or experience doesn't have to be an enemy, but it is some kind of a awakening as a natural expression of things as they are. That kind of gentleness is the mark of a Buddhist. Well, I should say, the mark of a practitioner. Not to be religious about the whole thing. The mark of a practitioner. Somebody who has not only acquainted himself with himself, but actually let go of that completely and can experience things as they are. Well, that's our discussion this evening. We have a class on Thursday, is it? Thursday? Well, continue to practice. We have a lot more to go. It's interesting. If you try to look for what comes next, you confound yourself. If you try to think of what you should remember, you confound yourself.